Korean Peninsula, November 1950. The B-29 Superfortress crews, flying their daylight bombing missions, held an ingrained confidence in their escort fighters, a trust forged in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. This conviction, however, was about to collide with a new, unforeseen reality, a threat that would fundamentally alter their understanding of air superiority and the efficacy of their protective umbrella. The stakes were immediate and visceral: the lives of aircrews, the success of strategic bombing campaigns, and ultimately, the very doctrine of air power. Captain Arthur Ace Miller, a seasoned B-29 pilot with 30 missions over North Korea already under his belt, often surveyed the distant, shimmering contrails of his F-86 Sabre escorts with a quiet reassurance. His B-29, City of Sacramento, was a leviathan of aluminum and intricate machinery designed for high-altitude precision bombing, and its survival hinged on the swift, aggressive intervention of those smaller, faster jets. The F-86, with its swept wings and 6.50 caliber machine guns, represented the pinnacle of fighter technology, a tangible shield against any aerial adversary. The prevailing operational doctrine, refined through years of wartime experience, dictated that the F-86s would engage and neutralize any enemy interceptors long before they could pose a significant threat to the bombers. Damage reports from earlier sorties consistently attributed losses primarily to MiG-15 attacks, with very few incidents linked to ground-based defenses. This pattern reinforced the belief that once the air was clear of MiGs, the bombers were largely safe, a perception that minimized the potential of anti-aircraft artillery. Engineers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, reviewing post-mission analyses, had initially categorized anti-aircraft fire as a secondary concern, noting the relatively low hit rates and the limited caliber of most observed North Korean batteries. Their assessments focused on aerodynamic stress from evasive maneuvers and structural fatigue from sustained high-altitude flight, rather than direct flak damage. The average B-29 mission encountered fewer than 5 direct flak hits, most of which were superficial, barely penetrating the outer skin. The strategic implications of this confidence were profound. Mission planners, drawing on intelligence reports that underestimated the rapid deployment and sophistication of Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft systems, continued to route bomber streams along predictable corridors. The emphasis remained on overwhelming aerial opposition, rather than developing tactics to mitigate ground-based threats. This tactical oversight, rooted in a misreading of the evolving battlefield, would soon exact a heavy toll. Miller, banking his superfortress through a thin layer of cirrus, maintained a vigilant scan of the sky, his eyes constantly seeking the telltale glint of an enemy fighter. He trusted his escorts implicitly, a trust born of countless hours flying in their protective company, a trust that would soon be profoundly tested. The Korean Peninsula, June 1950. The familiar roar of piston engines, a sound that had dominated the skies for a decade, began to cede its primacy to a new, sharper shriek. This nascent sound heralded the arrival of jet propulsion, a technology that would fundamentally reshape aerial warfare, and with it, the very definition of an escort fighter's utility. The P-51 Mustang, a venerable and proven design, found its speed and altitude advantages swiftly negated by the MiG-15. The MiG-15, a swept-wing jet interceptor, possessed a top speed approaching 1,075 kilometers per hour, a substantial increase over the Mustang's 700 kilometers per hour. Its operational ceiling of 15,500 meters far exceeded the Mustang's effective limit of 12,800 meters, creating a vertical arena where the piston engine fighter simply could not compete. This disparity in performance metrics rendered the traditional escort doctrine, predicated on matching or exceeding the bomber's speed and altitude, obsolete. The F-86 Sabre, America's primary response, entered service with a similar swept-wing design and a General Electric J-47 axial flow turbojet engine, capable of generating 23.1 kilonewtons of thrust. Its maximum speed of 1,106 kilometers per hour and service ceiling of 15,240 meters brought it into direct contention with the MiG-15. This technological parity, however, shifted the dynamics of Escort from a constant presence to a more fluid, reactive engagement. Early combat reports, compiled from debriefings of B-29 Superfortress crews, indicated a significant psychological impact when jet escorts were present. While the F-86 could not always maintain direct formation with the slower bombers, its ability to engage and deter MiG-15s in the vicinity provided a palpable sense of security. The very threat of Sabre intervention forced MiG pilots to operate with greater caution, altering their attack profiles. The armament of these new jet fighters also reflected a shift in combat philosophy. The F-86 carried 6.50 caliber M3 Browning machine guns, firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute per gun, a proven anti-aircraft weapon. The MiG-15, by contrast, mounted two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon, delivering a heavier, though slower, burst of fire, indicative of its interceptor role designed to quickly dismantle larger aircraft. The logistical demands of jet operations were also profoundly different. Jet engines consumed fuel at a much higher rate, drastically reducing loiter time over target areas. A typical F-86 combat patrol lasted approximately 90 minutes, compared to the Mustang's 3 to 4 hours. This necessitated a more complex logistical chain for refueling and rearming, and a greater number of aircraft to maintain continuous coverage. The strategic implications were clear. Air superiority over the target was no longer a given, even with escorts. The faster, higher-flying jets could arrive and depart with greater impunity, forcing bombers to rely more heavily on their own defensive armament and the element of surprise. The escort fighter's role transformed from a vigilant shadow to a rapid response interdictor, a defender of airspace rather than a constant companion. The introduction of jet technology marked a profound discontinuity in aerial warfare. The skies over Korea, once the domain of propeller-driven machines, became a crucible where the principles of jet combat were forged, irrevocably altering the future of air power. The era of the piston engine escort, a familiar and comforting presence, was quietly drawing to a close. The ground below, once a distant canvas of strategic targets, began to assert its own deadly presence. As the Luftwaffe's capacity to contest the skies diminished, the threat to Allied bombers and their escorts did not evaporate. It merely shifted its origin. The perceived invulnerability afforded by a clear sky free of enemy fighters proved to be a dangerous illusion, replaced by a new, insidious form of aerial attrition emanating from the Earth itself. This transformation was largely driven by the reallocation of German anti-aircraft assets. With fewer interceptors to protect, more 8.8 centimeter Flak 1836-37 and 12.8 centimeter Flak 40 batteries could be concentrated around vital industrial centers and strategic choke points. These weapons, originally designed to counter high-altitude bombers, now found renewed purpose against lower-flying targets, including the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that had so effectively swept the skies clean. The 8.8 centimeter Flak, an iconic and versatile weapon, fired a 9.2 kilogram shell to an effective ceiling of 10,600 meters. Its rate of fire, typically 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun, allowed for dense barrages. The larger 12.8 centimeter Flak 40, often mounted in twin configurations on massive concrete emplacements, hurled a 26-kilogram projectile to 14,800 meters with a rate of fire of 10 to 12 rounds per minute per barrel. These heavy guns, often networked through sophisticated Würzburg radar systems, created a lethal, invisible ceiling for Allied aircraft. Damage reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a stark increase in losses attributed to ground fire. A review of 8th Air Force combat losses for December 1944, for instance, indicated that 40% of all aircraft downed were victims of flak, a significant rise from previous months where fighter opposition dominated. This statistical shift underscored the growing efficacy of the German ground defenses, even as their air force withered. The psychological impact on pilots was profound. The clear skies, once a symbol of Allied air superiority, now held a new, unseen menace. The absence of enemy fighters, while a relief, did not equate to safety. Instead, the threat became omnipresent, emerging from the very terrain they sought to dominate. Pilots accustomed to dogfights and aerial maneuvers found themselves navigating an environment where evasive action against an unseen projectile was often too late. The sudden burst of black smoke, the metallic shriek of shrapnel, and the immediate loss of control became the new, terrifying reality. The escort fighters, designed to protect bombers from other aircraft, were not immune to this silent, rising tide of destruction. The shift in threat dynamics forced a reevaluation of mission profiles and tactics. Low-level strafing runs, once considered relatively safe in the absence of fighter opposition, became increasingly hazardous. The sheer volume of anti-aircraft fire, particularly around critical infrastructure, meant that even a brief pass could result in catastrophic damage. This ground-based resistance, though ultimately insufficient to turn the tide of the war, inflicted a steady, grinding toll. It served as a stark reminder that even in an era of overwhelming air power, the ground below retained its capacity for deadly defiance. The sky, though cleared of enemy wings, remained painted with the deadly bursts of unseen artillery. The eastern approaches to Berlin, March 1945. American bomber crews, accustomed to the sporadic, often inaccurate flak of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ground defenses, began to encounter a new, far more organized and lethal form of anti-aircraft fire. This was not the familiar German 88mm Flak 36, nor the lighter 20mm Flak 38, but something altogether different, a dense, coordinated barrage that seemed to erupt from every quadrant of the sky. Damage reports from the 381st Bomb Group's mission on March 18th, targeting the Berlin marshalling yards, documented an unprecedented concentration of heavy-caliber hits. Of the 34 B-17s that returned, 27 sustained significant damage from projectiles larger than 50 millimeters, with 3 aircraft forced to ditch over Allied lines due to structural failure and multiple engine losses. The patterns of fragmentation and impact angles suggested a sophisticated fire control system far beyond what intelligence had predicted for the retreating German forces. Examination of recovered shell fragments by ordnance specialists revealed distinctive manufacturing marks, unmistakably Soviet. These were 85mm M1939 anti-aircraft rounds. Known for their high explosive filler and effective sealing, and 100mm KS-19 rounds, a much newer, heavier weapon with a formidable destructive radius. The presence of these munitions, in such quantities, indicated a deliberate and substantial transfer of Soviet military hardware to the front lines. Production logs from Soviet factories, later declassified, showed a dramatic surge in anti-aircraft artillery output from late 1944 through early 1945, far exceeding the needs of their own advancing armies. For example, the Zavod No. 8 plant, a primary producer of the 85mm gun, recorded a 40% increase in monthly production between October 1944 and February 1945, with a significant portion allocated to forward deployment zones. This suggested a strategic decision to saturate the airspace over contested territories. The ideological implications were stark. As the Allied and Soviet forces converged on Germany, the lines of engagement blurred, and the perception of a common enemy began to erode. American airmen, who had long viewed the Soviets as allies, now found themselves under fire from weapons supplied and, in some cases, operated by Soviet personnel. This created a profound cognitive dissonance, a silent, unspoken question hanging in the cold, thin air above the shattered cities. The shifting allegiances, the unseen hands guiding the distant gun crews, introduced a new, chilling variable into the calculus of aerial warfare, a subtle but undeniable redefinition of the battlefield. The growing tally of downed aircraft began to cast a long shadow over the efficacy of deep strike missions. Initial damage assessments from returning bombers had often dismissed sporadic ground fire as an acceptable operational hazard, but by late 1944, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The B-17 Flying Fortress, renowned for its ruggedness, was increasingly returning, with critical systems compromised by 20mm and 37mm cannon hits, far beyond the light-caliber damage previously absorbed with relative impunity. Analysis of maintenance logs from the 8th Air Force revealed a marked increase in airframe repairs requiring extensive structural work, particularly in the wings and empennage. The average repair time for a flak-damaged B-17 escalated from 72 hours in June to over 150 hours by November, directly impacting aircraft availability rates. This extended downtime meant fewer aircraft were combat-ready for successive sorties, effectively reducing the operational strength of squadrons even without direct losses. The statistical reality of the anti-aircraft threat was stark. While fighter escorts significantly reduced losses to enemy interceptors, the percentage of bombers lost or severely damaged by ground fire on Eastern Front missions climbed from 3% in early 1944 to 12% by year's end. According to detailed mission reports, this shift indicated a fundamental change in the primary threat vector, moving from air-to-air engagements to a persistent, unavoidable barrage from below. This evolving threat profile had profound strategic implications for long-range bombing campaigns. Commanders were forced to reevaluate mission parameters, considering not just fuel range and fighter cover, but also the projected density of anti-aircraft emplacements along the flight path and target area. The psychological impact on aircrews was also palpable. The knowledge that even a successful evasion of enemy fighters did not guarantee safety from the relentless ground fire began to erode the once unshakable confidence in their aircraft's invulnerability. The robust construction that had once been a source of comfort now seemed merely to prolong the agony under a sustained barrage. Reports from debriefings frequently cited the painting of the sky with tracer fire, a visual testament to the sheer volume of projectiles directed skyward. The very air through which they flew became a hostile medium, a constant, unseen antagonist. Eastern Germany, March 1945. The once unquestioned supremacy of American air power began to fracture under the relentless, concentrated fire emanating from Soviet-held territory. This was not the sporadic, uncoordinated flak encountered over the Western Front. This was a meticulously organized, layered defense, designed to deny airspace with an efficiency that shocked Allied planners. The strategic implications were profound. For years, the prevailing doctrine had held that sufficient escort fighter presence could neutralize ground-based threats, allowing bombers to operate with acceptable losses. Now, damage reports from 8th Air Force missions targeting rail yards and industrial complexes near the Oder River painted a different picture. Aircraft returning with fuselages riddled by 37mm and 57mm shells, and occasionally 85mm impacts, indicated a density of anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, far exceeding previous estimates. Intelligence assessments, compiled from captured documents and prisoner interrogations, revealed the Soviet methodology. Rather than dispersing their AAA assets, they concentrated them in dense flak boxes around critical targets, creating overlapping fields of fire. The standard deployment included batteries of 85mm guns for high-altitude threats, complemented by 37mm and 57mm automatic cannons for medium and low-altitude engagements, often integrated with early warning radar systems like the Würzburg Ries and Freya units captured from the Germans and repurposed. This concentration meant that even with P-51 Mustangs flying top cover, the sheer volume of projectiles in the air during a bombing run became unsustainable. A single B-17 or B-24 might face hundreds of rounds from multiple calibers simultaneously, creating a lethal gauntlet. Production logs indicated that Soviet factories had ramped up AAA output significantly since 1943, with annual production of 37mm guns alone exceeding 10,000 units by 1944. The ideological underpinning of this Soviet defense was clear. Every inch of liberated territory was to be held, and any attempt to interfere with ground operations from the air would be met with overwhelming force. This contrasted sharply with the more reactive, less integrated German air defenses of earlier war years. The Soviets viewed air defense as an integral part of their ground strategy, not a separate domain. The consequence was a painful reevaluation of tactical approaches. Bombing altitudes were adjusted, evasive maneuvers became more aggressive, and mission planners began to consider the direct suppression of AAA sites as a primary objective rather than a secondary one. The pilots, who had once flown with an implicit trust in their escorts to clear the skies, now faced a sky that was actively hostile, regardless of fighter presence. The sustained losses over targets like Poltava and Mirgorod, even with the presence of P-51 Mustangs circling above, began to erode a fundamental tenet of American air power doctrine. The belief in aerial superiority, the conviction that sufficient fighter cover could always ensure the bomber's safe passage, was being challenged not by enemy fighters, but by an unseen, unmaneuverable threat from the ground. Damage reports from returning B-17s, meticulously compiled by intelligence officers, detailed impacts from 20mm, 37mm, and even 85mm projectiles, often concentrated in the wings and fuselage, areas deemed relatively safe from frontal fighter attacks. These reports were not isolated incidents, but a growing statistical trend. A review of combat mission summaries for Operation Frantic missions in June and July 1944 indicated a 1.8% increase in airframe damage attributed solely to anti-aircraft artillery, compared to missions over Western Europe during the same period, where fighter opposition remained the primary threat. The Soviet Flak, though less sophisticated in fire control than its German counterpart, compensated with sheer volume and a tactical deployment that seemed to anticipate American flight paths with uncanny accuracy. Its effectiveness was not in precision, but in creating a lethal, three-dimensional curtain of steel. The P-51 pilots, flying at altitudes often above the effective range of the heaviest flak, observed the bursts below with a growing sense of impotence. Their role was to engage enemy aircraft, a threat that rarely materialized over these specific Soviet targets. Their speed and agility, so decisive against Luftwaffe interceptors, offered no defense against projectiles arcing from miles below. The escort fighters could not suppress the flak. They could only watch its destructive work unfold, a silent witness to the bomber's vulnerability. Interrogation files from bomber crews, conducted immediately upon landing, consistently recorded descriptions of black puffs everywhere and the sound of hail on the fuselage. These first-hand accounts painted a picture of an environment where the sky itself became hostile, not just the machines within it. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who had faced German fighters with a degree of confidence, knowing their escorts would engage, now confronted an adversary that was impervious to their protectors. This realization began to reshape tactical thinking. The notion of a completely safe escort, one that could neutralize all threats, was proving illusory in this specific theater. The strategic implications were clear. If bombers could not be fully protected from ground fire, then mission planning would need to account for an unavoidable attrition rate, even in the absence of enemy air superiority. The inherent limitations of air-to-air combat doctrine against a terrestrial threat became starkly apparent. Korean Peninsula, 1951. The air above the Yalu River became a laboratory for a new kind of aerial combat, one where ground-based threats evolved with unprecedented speed. American pilots, accustomed to the relative sanctuary provided by escort fighters in the European theater, now faced a coordinated, multi-layered air defense system orchestrated by Soviet advisors and equipped with their latest technology. This shift in threat perception began subtly with isolated incidents of unexpectedly accurate anti-aircraft fire, but quickly escalated into a pervasive danger. The MiG alley dogfights, while iconic, often overshadowed the equally lethal and increasingly sophisticated ground environment that shaped tactical decisions and pilot psychology. The very sky, once a domain of perceived freedom, now held unseen perils. Soviet-supplied 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft artillery, often radar-directed, delivered a volume and precision of fire that far surpassed anything encountered in World War II. Damage reports from F-86 Sabres and B-29 Superfortresses consistently noted impacts from shells of these calibers, often concentrated in critical areas like wings and engines, indicating improved targeting. Beyond the kinetic threat, the introduction of ground-controlled interception (GCI) networks, overseen by Soviet air defense specialists, fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. These systems, integrating radar surveillance with fighter direction and anti-aircraft battery coordination, transformed static gun emplacements into dynamic components of a larger, responsive defense. The psychological impact on aircrews was profound. The comforting presence of escort fighters, while still vital for air-to-air engagements, offered little protection against the sudden, often invisible bursts of flak that could erupt from below. Mission debriefs frequently documented pilot observations of painted skies, a term that vividly conveyed the dense, often overwhelming barrages. This new reality forced an immediate reevaluation of attack profiles and bombing altitudes. Pilots learned to approach targets with greater caution, employing evasive maneuvers not just against enemy fighters, but against the unseen radar beams guiding ground fire. The emphasis shifted from pure speed and altitude to unpredictable flight paths and rapid changes in direction. The integration of radar with anti-aircraft guns represented a significant technological leap. While rudimentary radar-guided flak existed in World War II, the Korean War saw its widespread deployment and refinement, particularly with systems like the Soviet P-3 radar paired with 37mm guns. This allowed for effective engagement of targets at night and in adverse weather conditions, previously periods of relative safety for bombers. The strategic implication was clear. Air superiority could no longer be defined solely by control of the airspace against enemy aircraft. It now encompassed the ability to neutralize or suppress a sophisticated, integrated, ground-based threat. This demanded new tactics, new electronic countermeasures, and a deeper understanding of the adversary's command and control structures. The operational records from the Korean War indicate a measurable increase in aircraft losses attributed to anti-aircraft fire compared to prior conflicts, particularly among high-altitude bombers. For instance, A review of 8th Air Force combat losses in the European theater showed approximately 1.5% of sorties lost to Flak, whereas specific periods in Korea saw B-29 losses to ground fire reach 3% of sorties flown over heavily defended areas. The experience in Korea laid the groundwork for the development of dedicated wild weasel suppression missions and the evolution of electronic warfare as a primary component of aerial operations. The notion of a pilot's safety, once largely dependent on the prowess of their wingmen, was now intrinsically linked to the efficacy of jamming pods and radar woe. The lessons learned from the painted skies over North Korea would resonate for decades, shaping Air Force doctrine and aircraft design. The perceived invulnerability of high-flying bombers, once a cornerstone of strategic air power, was irrevocably challenged by the precision and coordination of Soviet-designed air defense systems. The production logs from the Soviet Tula Arms plant in 1952 show a 40% increase in 37mm anti-aircraft gun production compared to the previous year, reflecting the urgent demand for these systems.